We're going to take a quick look at a very important game that was played in this variation. Now, this was a very one-sided game, but I want to present to you the kind of pressures that white faces if they don't play it accurately. This was played back in 2014 when the FIDE Grand Prix series for women was different than the one for the Open, and they had their own cycle going, which was very confusing and complicated. But at this point, Yifan was the world women's champion, and she was playing in the Grand Prix, which of course doesn't happen anymore. She's playing against one of the stronger women in Mongolia, Batchimeg Tushintugs, and she employed this idea of knight bd7, knight f3, and as I had recommended, the move h6. Now notice that she didn't play it in the move order that I'm recommending, which is to start with the move c5, d5, and play h6. If you forget your move orders, as long as you know the concepts of the position, you should usually be more or less okay in most of them. In this case, after bishop c3, bc3, d6, she has her own reasons on delaying h6. There are some variations here that don't involve h6, g5, in which the bishop is more vulnerable on g5. They're perfectly acceptable. You can try them out yourself, but they are not the ones I'm recommending. It ends up transposing into the exact position I am recommending. However, after h6, it still doesn't make any sense for white to give up the dark square bishop with bishop takes f6, and bishop f4 runs into e5, and of course a fork on e4, which just loses the game immediately. Therefore, bishop h4 is the only move. And I like the approach Yifan took here in this position of putting the immediate pressure in the center with knight b6. Now, this might have surprised her opponent, as most people, at least at the 2600 level, decide to short castle here after pawn takes, knight takes d5. We've already seen this idea of importantly playing ideas of knight c7 very quickly, specifically queen d2, knight c7, with the idea of keeping g5 as an idea, with also d5 being played very, very quickly. Instead, Tushintugs eliminated the pressure in the center with d takes e6, which is something that you probably see a lot in your games, especially if you're not quite at the international or grandmaster level, in which it is difficult for white to really know when to keep the tension in the center and when not to. And in this case, even though Tushintugs herself is an international master, she isn't able to take the correct decision of sacrificing the pawn. Remember that from a practical aspect, it's very difficult to just give your pawns away. After bishop c6, knight d2, white seems to be consolidating in some ways. For example, if I manage to put the pawn on e4, short castle, keep this bishop alive, I can start thinking of putting pressure on d6, I can start putting pressure on the center with f4, and in essence, white has what looks like very comfortable play. Pair of bishops, he has c4 as a weakness, but d6, let's remember, might compensate for it, and yet none of this actually pans out for white. It actually is too slow. And not only that, black's position is very good, whereas white's lacks coordination. I'm about to show you why. Long castle was played, which really changes the dynamics of the position. Immediately, I'm not so happy as white about short castling and having to deal with something like g5, bishop g3, h5. This is already something that over the board would worry me quite a bit. My bishop's getting trapped, h4, h3 is an idea. I don't have an immediate counterattack, and because of this idea that I have to put pressure on my opponent as well, Tushintugs decided that after long castles, to play the very natural looking move a4. a4 destabilizes the knight on b6, and of course I don't want to play the move a5 as the rook b1. The knight on b6 will always be somewhat of a target. The b file is after all semi-open. Instead, after a4, Yifan does what we've been taught since we were beginning on chess strategy, that you meet a flank attack with a break in the center, and of course she played the move d5. Normally, it is not advisable to open up the position for the bishops, but let's remember that chess is a complex game. In this scenario, we can't only look at the fact that white has bishops, it's also important to notice that white is lacking development. In essence, if I take on d5 here with a pawn, already black has many very tempting options on how to take back. The most natural being knight takes d5, which gains yet another tempo for my development. Knight c3 is definitely an issue. knight takes e3 is also an issue, as I take on d3 with a discovery attack, and a simple move like queen c2 doesn't really help white's attack, after which I can continue whether it is g5 to attack directly on the king side, or even something fancy which actually does work, like knight f4, attacking this bishop on d3, attacking g2, and using the fact that you haven't developed on this discovery attack with the battery with the queen on e7 and the bishop on e6. In essence, you cannot take on f4 because of bishop b3 check, and you lose the queen. Tushin-Tux decided that she needed to hold on to her structure, which is a very logical approach, but it's just insufficient in this case. After queen e2, she holds on to the pawn on c4, and in this position, g5, bishop g3, d takes c4, knight takes c4, and after I swap all of the pieces, knight e4 comes in with terrible threats. Notice that white's king on e1 looks like it's just one tempo away from safety, after which I'll bring my pieces to the queen side, and this king on c8 might be a little bit weak. But there just is not enough time to do all of that. After, for example, long castles, you have a little bit of an issue. Notice that knight d2 doesn't quite work because I have this idea of queen g4 check. But if I throw in the move h5, which immediately puts pressure on this bishop, threatening the move h4, trapping the bishop for good, and white does something like f3 or h3 to give it some air, first of all, you have issues with knight takes g3 and queen takes e3. But to finish the game immediately, black can decide to play the move knight d2, forking the queen and the rook, and there's just nowhere near enough compensation. Notice that the pawn on h5 now defends against any check that white might try, and down the exchange, this game is pretty hopeless. After knight e4, h3 was Tushin-Tux's idea, but it just was not sufficient. Knight takes g3 happened, queen g4 check, and after queen d7, it was obvious that she is in a world of trouble. Taking on d7, for example, rook takes d7, pawn takes e3 is just a very inferior, almost lost endgame. I can even play rook d3, fork e3 and c3, and this position was going to crumble. Basically, there is no pawn structure here for the white side. After queen d7, you cannot really take on g3, since after queen d2 check, you are bound to get mated in the next couple of moves, as you must play king f1, and the king has nowhere near enough time to start running, not to mention that I can always take on c3 and be up a pawn. However, after queen d7, f takes g3 was probably even worse than anything that Tushin-Tux could have done, as keeping the queens alive after rook h e8, king to f5 was enough for her to resign, as there is no way to defend the queen and prevent the penetration of black's queen on d2. Notice that this one tempo that white lacked throughout the game was extremely important. Maybe this move a4 was already the culprit of white being much worse, but even in this position after castles, I don't think that white had a good position at all. But that one move that Tushin-Tux gave Hu Yifan with a4 was sufficient for the Chinese player, the Chinese brilliant player, to take the game with aggressive moves that kept up the initiative, kept up the pressure, and never let go. From this moment forwards, Tushin-Tux always found herself on the defensive side of the position, and her position was not strong enough that it just kind of held together, because black has so many ideas. She has so much development, she has g5, h5 on tap, and importantly, white never got that timing to castle. I hope this game is a little bit of an inspirational one on how even strong players like Tushin-Tux can just melt down in a position like this one, in which black is given a little bit of an initiative.